Welcome back. Well, the Coalition has already promised to abolish the biosecurity tax announced in the last week budget. The Nationals in particular have accused Labor of unfairly targeting farmers, saying the new levy will also affect consumers at the supermarket checkout. Joining me now is the Nationals leader, David Littleproud, live from Rockhampton. David, thanks so much for your time. I'm sure the government isn't calling this a farmers' tax, but you are. Take us through how it's actually going to affect farmers.
Well, they're putting a 10% tax on the levies that farmers pay to research and development corporations to pay for the biosecurity risks of their foreign competitors. Now, in what parallel universe would any sovereign government charge its own farmers the costs of bringing in their foreign competitors' goods to this country? Now, what happens is that cost will have to be passed on, and will have to be passed on at the checkout. Farmers can't absorb that when there are alternative options, one in which we're going to implement ourselves. In fact, would have implemented by Christmas last year, and that is a container levy. And Murray Watt's now saying, oh, we're going to explore a container levy. Well, the work had already been done. His department had done that work. I'd already put that in place so that it could be implemented in December last year, so that you would charge your foreign competitors the biosecurity costs for the risk that they pose, rather than Australian farmers.
But isn't
this is just pure insanity.
Isn't that what we essentially complain China's been doing to us on a smaller scale? I mean, wouldn't that just be an extra tariff? I do note that biosecurity...
No, it's not a tariff.
Biosecurity is getting much more expensive. I mean, you have the example of cars needing to be sent back a couple of months ago because they contained a pest. So who should be paying for all this?
Well, those who pose the risk. The importers that bring that biosecurity risk to this country. And we are, in fact, charged ourselves when we take our product to foreign countries to make sure that we meet their biosecurity standards. That's well within WTO guidelines, and one in which that work had already been completed. So for Murray Watt to say, oh, we're going to go and check to see if this is in WTO guidelines is nonsense. That work has been done, that can be implemented, and it's actually one in which importers want to pay. Because if you have a boat bobbing out outside a port for a day, it costs them about $120,000 a day. So what they want to do is be able to process those containers quickly, and they're prepared to pay this container levy to make sure that those containers be processed off the dock and out around the country as quickly as they can, so long as those biosecurity risks are looked at. And that's what it all is. It's a user pay model, one in which Australian farmers will pay when they send their commodity to another country. But instead, our government is saying our farmers should pay for their competitors to bring their goods to this country. That's just pure insanity, and that has to be passed on by Australian farmers. And when we're saying to Australians, buy Australian produce, we're actually putting the competitive advantage to our foreign competitors above our Australian farmers. That doesn't breach any WTO rules. That's just not common sense, and this government needs to rethink it. The work has been done. Murray Watt's been lazy, and he's left the door open for us to support foreign importers over Australian farmers.
Okay, I tell you what is a problem, has been quite a big problem for some time that successive governments have ignored, and that is housing in both rural areas, in the regions, in the cities as well. State governments, local councils and their approval process, and the federal government all to blame here. As you sit here now, this morning, we see, the government's Housing Future Fund. I know you're not supporting it in the Senate. The New South Wales state government is starting to tinker around the edges here. What actually needs to be done in a meaningful way to actually get these homes built? Because it's all about supply, right?
Exactly, and this is where we have to have a national conversation, where Australians that want to live, particularly in a capital city, they might have to appreciate that the quarter-acre block dream is gone. That if you want to live in a capital city, if we want to increase supply and increase supply quickly, we have to go up, not out. That's how you get supply quickly.
I mean, I don't know a lot of people live in the city on a quarter-acre block, to be honest.
No, but they're still trying to push out. You don't have to drive outside Melbourne to go towards Shepparton, and the amount of beautiful agricultural productive land that is being taken up for housing instead of growing your food and fibre, it just doesn't make sense. This is where you need to have the courage to say to those and to the planning, local government and state authorities that hold that planning pen, to have that conversation and to speed up supply. The quickest way is to go up where there's market failure, and that market failure is invariably in regional regional areas. That's where federal governments, but particularly state and local governments, need to inject themselves. And that's I'm not really having a crack at the federal government on this. It's an abject failure of state and local governments that we've got ourselves into this situation because they hold the planning pen. Federal governments have never had to do any of this work. It's always been through GST returns that state and local governments should plan for this. The fact that we've had to inject ourselves with a failed policy of borrowing $10 billion. They're not putting $10 billion into housing. They're borrowing $10 billion, paying interest, and hope that they can invest that $10 billion and get a return above the interest rate they're paying. And if they make anything, they'll put into housing. That's a silly way to try and address supply. This is about actually changing the planning pen, have the courage to do it, and state and local governments need to get on with the job rather than failed policy that even the Greens can see really has no future in shifting the dial in lifting supply.
No one's pretending that's the answer, though. It may be part of the solution, but it's all down to states, isn't it? State and local councils. They're the ones with the land.
Well, it is. And this is where they can give the planning approval. And the fact that we've got this is an abject failure of state and local governments that we've got to this point. There is a point in regional areas where we've got challenges, where there isn't a market tension for developers to come in. But this government's going to bring 1.5 million new migrants. They've deferred $120 billion worth of infrastructure in supporting bringing those 1.5 million new migrants. And so if you're out there today, you'd be pretty angry that your rent's going to go up and the cost of housing is going to go up because you're bringing 1.5 million migrants that you're going to compete with without a plan, without the infrastructure spend to support it. This budget just was a welfare budget about trying to help a few rather than looking at investing in the long-term solutions this country needs, not just on housing, but inflationary pressures.
Sorry to interrupt, David, but if it did go beyond just helping the most vulnerable, which I think we can kind of agree that that's what it's done, you'd be sitting here today with me saying, oh, it's inflationary.
Well, of course it's inflation when you're putting $21 billion extra into the economy,
and
the ones that are getting the
support. With Lamito not being continued.
But let me just finish. When you're putting that into welfare payments that'll actually be spent out in the economy, and then you've got households that have got mortgages out there, that this is actually putting pressure in potentially lifting rates another 25 points, or at the very best, holding rates high. So who pays for that? It's the working poor out there that this government's created. Those men and women that they haven't necessarily have to spend money to bring down the inflationary pressures. It's not about necessarily just spending money. It's about good policy, whether it be on housing or migration or even energy. If you look at the energy, the inflation number in the last month only came down about 0.2%. But if you go to the drivers, energy went up 14.3%. That's not about having to put more money in. The only reason they're giving $500 to households is because of their failed energy policy of not lifting supply. And they've torn away at our firming energy like gas, and we're drawing down on supplies and not increasing it. It means prices are going up. So you don't have to spend Australian taxpayers' money to give support. You just need sensible policy, and that's where Jim Chalmers and Anthony Albanese missed the mark on this year's budget.
But long term, do you agree that renewables are going to be far cheaper?
Well, it depends where they are and how you do them. The way that this government wants to do them, they want to have 28,000 kilometres of new transmission lines to connect them. Now, there's a way to make sure, and we're not against renewables, but we're saying there's a place for solar panels. That's on people's roofs, particularly in capital cities, because that's the concentrated area where the energy's needed. So why wouldn't you put them on the landscape that needs them the most and the population that needs them most, which is the big cities, rather than I'm outside Rockhampton on pristine agricultural landscape, but also native bushland where koala habitat, glider habitat is going to be destroyed for wind towers, solar panels and transmission lines. Let's use some common sense. We've got sovereignty of all our resources, not just renewables, but if you want renewables to have the social licence they need, there is a landscape in which they can be put on. That's on rooftops and wind towers offshore. And that also alleviates much of the need for the 28,000 kilometres of new transmission lines you're going to have to pay for. Half your energy bill already is poles and wires. And Gillard gold-plated them. This mob is platinum plating. So let's use some common sense. Let's work through this. Let's make sure we've got the firming to make sure renewables work, that they have a social licence to work and that they're not destroying landscape. And we firm it with gas and particularly SMR, small-scale modular nuclear technology, in old coal-fired power stations so you can plug them them in where existing power lines are. That's common sense. That's the national solution. I wrote to the Prime Minister and said, let's have a national energy summit to get that balance right. Let's pause. We've got to 2050. We will do it a lot quicker if we use common sense and use what we've got without costing us more.
David Littleproud, good to talk to you as always. Thanks so much.